In the summer of 1945, the most feared fortress line in Asia sat waiting along the border of Manchuria. 800 miles of reinforced concrete, walls 9 feet thick, poured to survive a direct hit from a 1-ton bomb, underground tunnels, armored gun turrets, hidden artillery, and garrisons told to fight to the last man. The Japanese called one of these strongholds the Oriental Maginot Line, and they believed nothing on earth could break it. Then the Red Army arrived with trucks. Not tanks, not heavy bombers. Trucks. Ordinary cargo trucks with steel rails bolted across the back, each one stacked with rows of 132mm rockets. And when those rockets left the rails, they made a sound that grown men never forgot. A long, rising scream, hundreds of warheads tearing through the sky at once, and then a wall of fire that swallowed entire hillsides. The Japanese had spent 11 years building those forts. The Soviet rocket trucks helped to raise the army defending them in 11 days. This is the story of the Katyusha in Manchuria. The weapon Germany already feared on the Eastern Front turned east in the final week of the Second World War and aimed at the proudest army Japan had left. To understand why a truck terrified an empire, you have to go back to a forest in 1941, on the other side of the Soviet Union. It was the 14th of July, 1941, near the town of Orsha. The German army was driving deep into Soviet territory, and a young captain named Ivan Flerov commanded something the world had never seen in action. 7 strange launch vehicles, kept under such tight secrecy that even his own men barely understood them. Each one carried rails loaded with rockets instead of a normal gun. Flerov had orders that went beyond firing the weapon. If capture ever loomed, he was to blow the launchers to scrap so the Germans could never study them. The secret mattered as much as the salvo. Flerov gave the order. In a matter of seconds, every rocket fired. The German troops crowded around the Orsha rail station, looked up and saw the sky itself turn to fire. The barrage flattened the station and everything near it. The survivors could not explain what had hit them. There was no line of artillery, no visible battery, just a few trucks that appeared, screamed, and vanished. The soldiers who fired it never gave it an official name. They saw a factory stamp with the letter K and started calling it Katyusha, after a popular wartime song about a girl waiting for her sweetheart. The Germans had a different name for it. They called it Stalin's organ, because the rows of launch rails looked like the pipes of a church organ, and because the wail of the rockets sounded like the devil playing one. The weapon was simple, and that was the genius of it. A real artillery piece is precise. It places one shell on one point, then reloads, then fires again. The Katyusha did the opposite. It was never built to hit one target. It was built to drown an entire area in high explosives in a single breath. Look at the rocket itself for a moment, because the design tells you everything. Each M13 was a finned steel tube, about 6 feet long, weighing roughly 92 pounds, with around 10 pounds of high explosive packed into the warhead. It was not accurate. The fins spun it for a little stability, but a single rocket could drift well off course, and the crews knew it. That was the point. You did not aim one rocket at one man. You launched dozens of imperfect rockets across a whole map square and let the spread do the work. Inaccuracy, multiplied by volume, became its own kind of precision. A single BM-13 launcher carried 16 rockets on 8 rails. But the Soviets rarely fired just one. They fired them in batteries, in whole regiments, hundreds of launchers at once. A battery of 4 trucks could empty its rails in 7 to 10 seconds and drop more than 4 tons of high explosive onto the enemy. A full regiment firing together could blanket an area the size of dozens of football fields in a single salvo. And here is the catch that shaped how the Soviets used it. After those 7 to 10 seconds of fury, the launcher was empty, and reloading it by hand took a trained crew the better part of 10 minutes. 10 minutes is a lifetime under return fire. So the doctrine was brutal and clean. Mass the trucks in secret, fire everything at once, then move before the enemy could shoot back. The launcher itself rode on a Studebaker truck shipped in by the thousands from American factories, a 6-wheeled hauler that could only manage about 24 miles an hour on a good road, but that was fast enough to fire and flee. Imagine being on the receiving end. There is no warning shot. There is no slow ranging in. One moment, the field is quiet. The next, the air is full of screaming, and then the ground around you is nothing but fire, smoke, and broken earth. Even soldiers who survived a Katyusha strike were often too stunned to fight. They sat in their trenches, ears ringing, minds blank, while the enemy infantry walked in. German reports from the Eastern Front described whole positions found later with the men unmarked, killed by the blast pressure alone, their bodies pulled apart by the shock of so many warheads landing inside a few seconds. By the time the war in Europe ended, the Katyusha had become a symbol of Soviet firepower. It had screamed over Stalingrad. It had announced the assault on Berlin. The Germans had learned to fear that rising wail more than almost any other sound on the battlefield. But the Soviets were not finished. While the world celebrated victory in Europe, Joseph Stalin had already promised his allies one more campaign. At the conferences with Britain and the United States, he had given his word that within roughly 3 months of Germany's defeat, the Red Army would turn against Japan. The clock on that promise had started in May. By August, it was nearly run out, and the target was the one major enemy still standing. The Japanese Empire held a vast stretch of northern China called Manchuria, and guarding it was the Kwantung army, around 700,000 men, long considered the pride of the Japanese military. For decades, this was where Japan sent its best officers and its most aggressive plans. The Kwantung army had started wars, it had conquered territory, it believed it was unbeatable, and it was sitting behind the strongest border defenses in all of Asia. Starting in the 1930s, the Japanese had carved 17 fortified regions into the Manchurian border. More than 80,000 permanent structures spread along a frontier roughly 3,000 miles long. Concrete bunkers linked by tunnels, gun turrets sunk into hillsides. Underground barracks, power plants, hospitals, and ammunition stores, all built to let a garrison fight for weeks, even while completely surrounded. Some of these works ran 4 and 5 stories deep into the rock, with elevators, ventilation systems, and water wells so that men could live and fight underground for a month without ever seeing daylight. The largest of them sat near a place called Hutou. Its walls and roofs were reinforced concrete up to 9 feet thick, designed to shrug off a direct hit from a 1-ton aerial bomb. Buried inside the Hutou complex was a single enormous artillery piece, a naval-caliber gun built to range across the river and strike the Soviet railway on the far bank. It was the kind of weapon that made a garrison feel untouchable. The defenders nicknamed the whole system the Oriental Maginot line, after the famous fortress wall France had built against Germany. They meant it as a boast. They were certain it would hold. There was just one problem. Those forts were designed to stop the threats the Japanese had imagined in the 1930s. Infantry charging across open ground, field guns rolling up to the wire, bombers flying over one at a time. The concrete was thick enough to survive all of that. Nobody who poured that concrete had planned for a wall of rockets falling out of the sky all at once. That was about to flip. Across the border, the Soviets had been quietly moving an enormous force east. Trains had been running day and night for months, hauling men and machines thousands of miles from the battlefields of Europe to the empty plains of the Far East. It was one of the largest secret movements of an army in history, more than 100,000 rail cars rolling across Siberia, the cargo hidden under tarps and disguised as ordinary freight. By August, the Red Army had gathered more than 1.5 million men, around 5,500 tanks, and tens of thousands of guns, mortars, and rocket launchers along the Manchurian frontier. The whole campaign answered to Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, one of the architects of the Soviet victory over Germany. Below him, 3 great fronts would strike at once. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's Transbaikal front would swing in from the west, across the desert, and over a mountain range the Japanese thought impassable. In the east, the First Far Eastern Front under Marshal Kirill Meretskov would smash straight into the strongest belt of border forts. And from the north, the Second Far Eastern Front under General Maxim Perkayev would push across the rivers. And riding with those eastern armies, hidden among the supply columns, were the rocket trucks. If you had asked a Japanese officer in early August what would happen if the Soviets attacked, he would have told you the border forts would buy weeks, months even, long enough for the rest of the army to gather and counterattack. They had no idea the clock had already started. On the 9th of August 1945, just after midnight, it began. The first warning many Japanese defenders got was the storm. A real one. Heavy summer rain hammered the border that night, and the Soviets used it as cover, sending infantry forward in the dark without the usual long artillery bombardment to announce them. In some sectors, Soviet assault troops were inside the Japanese wire before the garrison even knew the war had come. The timing was no accident. Soviet planners had chosen the worst possible weather on purpose, betting that the same rain and mud that slowed their own boots would also keep the defenders blind and the Japanese Air Force on the ground. But the fortified regions were too strong to simply walk past. At Hutou, at Suifenhe, at the strongpoint near Halong, the concrete held exactly as the Japanese had promised. Machine guns swept the approaches. Buried artillery fired from slits no rifle could reach. The first Soviet infantry to test those walls learned quickly that courage alone would not crack 9 feet of concrete. Men went down in the mud in front of the firing slits, and the slits kept firing. At Suifenhe, the defenders sat on high ground and turned the open approaches into a long, exposed killing field. The garrison there had registered every gully and every rise in advance, and they made the Soviets pay for each yard. So the Red Army brought up the trucks. This is the part most people never hear about. The Katyusha was famous for shredding troops in the open, but in Manchuria it was given a different job. Its rockets could not punch through 9 feet of reinforced concrete. No rocket could. Instead, the Soviets used it to do something just as deadly. They used it to seal the fortress and break the men inside. Here is how it worked. A Japanese strongpoint was not just one bunker. It was a web of trenches, gun pits, machine gun nests, and infantry positions spread across the hillside around the main concrete core. Those outer positions were where the garrison actually fought. And those positions were soft. Earth and timber and exposed men. When the rocket regiments opened fire, that entire hillside disappeared under high explosive. In 7 to 10 seconds, every trench, every gun pit, every exposed defender was buried in fire and shattered ground. The men deep inside the main bunker might survive, sealed behind their concrete, but they were now blind, deaf, and alone. Their outer defenses were gone. The soldiers who were supposed to stop the Soviet infantry were dead or stunned senseless. There was a second effect, just as important, that the crews counted on. The rockets did not only kill, they terrified. A man crouched in a firing slit could hold his nerve against rifle fire and against shells that came one at a time. He could count them, and counting gave him a kind of control. But there was no counting a Katyusha salvo. It arrived as one continuous roar, the ground heaving under him, dust and concrete grit choking the air inside the bunker, the lights swinging or going out. Even behind 9 feet of concrete, the will to keep fighting could break long before the wall did. And that was when the Soviet assault teams moved in. Engineers with explosive charges, flamethrower crews, infantry with satchels of grenades. They walked across ground the rockets had just scoured clean, right up to the firing slits and the steel doors, and they went to work on the fortress from point-blank range. These assault groups had a craft all their own, learned the hard way in the ruins of Stalingrad, Budapest, and Berlin. The engineers carried shaped charges and bundled explosives meant to be jammed against a steel door or stuffed straight into a firing slit. The flamethrower men did not try to burn through concrete. They aimed the burning fuel at the slit itself, sucking the oxygen out of the chamber behind it and turning the inside of the bunker into an oven. Riflemen covered them, watching the neighbouring slits, ready to shoot anything that moved. Where a door would not give, the engineers climbed onto the roof and lowered charges down the ventilation shafts, killing the garrison through the very system built to keep them alive. It was slow, close, and merciless, and the rockets were what made it possible at all. The pattern repeated up and down the border. The rockets did not have to destroy the fort. They only had to strip away everything around it so the assault teams could reach it. Drown the hillside, then send in the men. Drown the next one, then send in the men again. If you are finding this story worth your time, take a second to subscribe. This channel digs into the weapons that decided the Second World War, and there is a lot more coming. By the third day, the whole Japanese plan was coming apart. The fortified regions had been built to fight as a connected line, each fort covering its neighbors, the garrisons trading strength back and forth. But the Soviet tempo never gave them the chance. The forts were being isolated and reduced one by one, faster than anyone in the Kwantung Army Command had thought possible. Worse, the Japanese command had pulled most of its strength back from the border weeks earlier, planning to fight a slower battle in the interior. So the great forts were left holding the frontier with fewer men than their builders had ever intended, each one a strong wall with too few hands to defend it. And it was not only the forts. While the rocket regiments were cracking the border, Soviet tank armies were pouring through the gaps. Marshal Malinovsky's columns had done the impossible in the west, dragging entire mechanized armies across a mountain range and a stretch of desert the Japanese had written off as a natural wall. Those tank crews crossed peaks more than a mile high and then ran their engines dry on the far side, outpacing their own fuel trucks so badly that transport planes had to drop gasoline to them in the open country. There were no fortified regions waiting back there, because no one believed an army could come that way. So when Soviet tanks appeared deep behind the border, the defenders realized the truth all at once. They were not holding a line anymore. They were trapped inside a collapsing pocket. The Kwantung army tried to react, but it had been hollowed out over the previous year, its best units and best equipment stripped away to defend the home islands and the Pacific. Many of the men left holding the line were raw conscripts and reservists, some pulled from the Japanese farming colonies in Manchuria only weeks before, handed a rifle and pointed at the border. The army that was supposed to be Japan's iron fist had become a shell wearing its old reputation, and it was now being hit by more than 1.5 million Soviet veterans who had just spent 4 years learning how to break a fortified enemy on the plains of Europe. The screaming rockets kept coming. Every time a Japanese unit tried to form a new defensive position, the rocket trucks found it and drowned it. There was no front line stable enough to dig in. There was no quiet stretch long enough to regroup. The high explosive simply followed them, hillside after hillside, day after day. A Japanese counterattack needed men massed together to have any weight, but massing men together was exactly what the Katyusha punished hardest. Every attempt to gather a fist of soldiers turned that fist into a target. Many Japanese garrisons fought with terrible courage. They had been raised on the idea that surrender was the deepest disgrace, and a great number of them chose to die in place rather than give up. At fort after fort, the defenders held until they were buried in their own bunkers. Some sealed the doors from the inside and fought until the air ran out. Others, when the assault teams broke in, turned their last grenades on themselves. But courage could not change the math. The Soviets had the men, the tanks, and above all, the firepower to keep grinding forward without pause. On the 15th of August, the Emperor of Japan announced his nation's surrender. But out on the Manchurian border, in the dark and the smoke, that word took time to arrive, and even longer to be believed. The Kwantung Army formally began surrendering to the Soviets on the 16th of August. Organized resistance across Manchuria broke apart inside the 11-day window from the 9th to the 20th of August. 11 days. That was all it took to shatter an army of 700,000 men and the strongest fortress line in Asia. 11 years of concrete undone in less than 2 weeks. But not every garrison got the message, or believed it. At Hutou, the great fortress they had called the Oriental Maginot Line, a pocket of defenders refused to accept that the war was over. They were sure the surrender broadcast was a Soviet trick, a recording made to lure them out of their walls and into the open. So they kept fighting, sealed inside their 9-foot walls, long after the rest of Manchuria had fallen silent. The Soviets even sent Japanese prisoners forward to call out the news of the surrender, to convince the holdouts it was real. The garrison killed the messengers and fought on. The Red Army surrounded them and gave them the same treatment it had given every other strongpoint. Rockets and shells rained down on the outer works. Assault teams crept in close. Engineers worked the ventilation shafts and the steel doors. And still the garrison would not yield. The fight at Hutou did not end until the 26th of August, days after the official surrender, days after the Second World War was supposed to be finished. When it was finally over, the numbers told the whole brutal story. Of roughly 1,400 Japanese defenders at Hutou, only 53 came out alive. The fortress that was built to survive a 1-ton bomb had become a tomb for almost everyone inside it. The thick concrete that was supposed to save the garrison had instead made sure that when the end came, there was no way out of it. So why did it happen this way? Why did the proudest army Japan had left, behind the thickest concrete in Asia, collapse so completely and so fast? Part of the answer is the larger picture. The Kwantung army was weaker than its reputation. The Soviets were overwhelming in numbers and battle-hardened from Europe. The surprise was total, and the Japanese plan assumed a slow, methodical attack that never came. But part of the answer sits right there in those rocket trucks. The Japanese had built their entire defense around a single bet. The bet that no attacker could deliver enough firepower, fast enough, to overwhelm a fort before its garrison could respond. For decades, against the weapons they had imagined, that bet was sound. Concrete beats bullets. Concrete beats field guns. Concrete even beats a single bomber. The Katyusha broke the bet. It did not outthink the fortress. It did not find a clever weak point. It simply delivered more high explosive, in less time, onto more ground, than any defense built in the 1930s was ever designed to absorb. It turned the space around each fort into a killing zone that no soldier could survive standing up. And once the men outside the concrete were gone, the concrete itself was just an expensive coffin. Think about the contrast for a second. The fort was the most expensive kind of weapon there is. 11 years of labor, mountains of cement, miles of tunnel, a fortune in steel and guns. The thing that undid it was a cheap steel rocket that could not even be aimed properly, fired off the back of an American cargo truck. The defenders had bet everything on permanence. The Soviets won with something disposable, fired by the hundreds, and never meant to last more than 10 seconds in the air. There is a strange kind of irony in it. The Japanese had named their fortress line after the Maginot Line, the French defences that Germany had simply gone around in 1940. They thought they were building something stronger, something that could not be bypassed. And in a way they were right. The Soviets did not go around the Manchurian forts. They went straight through them on a tide of rockets. The same weapon that had screamed over the rubble of Berlin only months earlier now screamed over the hills of Manchuria. From one end of the largest war in history to the other, the Katyusha carried the same simple, terrifying promise. Wherever those rails pointed, the sky was about to fall. 11 years of concrete, 11 days of fire, and an army that thought itself unbreakable, broken by a line of trucks. If you want to see how the Red Army turned the impossible march across the greater Khingan Mountains into the trap that sealed the Kwantung Army's fate, that story is on screen right now. Go watch it.